And I want to give another round of thank yous to our leadership sponsor, HBO Documentary Films, our major sponsors, Amazon Studios, A&E Indie Films, History Films, and Netflix, our supporting sponsors, Image Nation, Abu Dhabi, Showtime Documentary Films, and Sony, our lead media sponsors, Vulture and WNET, and a big thank you to the Doc NYC staff and volunteers. The whole 8 days of Doc NYC Pro is co-presented by Amazon Studios. And then today's, Deborah, the Pitch Perfect Day is co-presented by A&E Indie Films. And this panel, Insider versus Outsider Storytelling, is co-presented by Image Nation Abu Dhabi, as is the reception upstairs that will follow this panel. So thank you to them. Now I'm going to join this group of panelists. When we conceived of this panel a couple months ago, Insider versus Outsider Storytelling, I think it's of a perennial interest and importance in the world of documentary filmmaking, but as so much that we've been looking at the festival, it takes on an added meaning after our election, when we're asking ourselves big questions about reaching out across cultural divides and trying to understand other people. So the idea behind this conversation is when we are bridging cultures in our documentary filmmaking, being aware of the differences of perspective when whether you come at something as an insider or as an outsider. And I think that there are pros and cons to both perspectives. Sometimes there's obvious advantages to being an insider, especially when you're talking about language and perception of customs. But there can also be difficulties as an insider in that maybe it's sometimes harder to see a bigger picture, or you have certain loyalties that are hard to challenge. So we want to open up that conversation, and we've put together a team of filmmakers whose work really reflects some of that kind of filmmaking. So what I'm going to do in the structure of this panel is I'm going to go down this row one by one and talk to each filmmaker a little bit and share an example of one of their projects with a trailer or a clip, and then we'll open it up to a wider conversation on stage about this topic, and then we will open it up to the audience for questions to continue it further. So I'm going to start with Julia Bacha at the end. Julia first came to my attention with her film Budrus, that won many awards, including the Ridenour Prize that I sit on the jury of, backed by the Nation Institute. And most recently today, she unveiled for the first time the new project that she's working on, that is that was at our Pitch Perfect session. So I'm sure many of you here already heard it at the Pitch Perfect session, so we won't go too in depth in repeating ourselves. But for the sake of anyone who wasn't here, we have a clip. But Julia, can you just kind of briefly set up what this project is?
Absolutely. Just quickly, I'm a documentary filmmaker that works with a team at Just Vision, and this is a very interesting topic in regard to our group, because we are a mixed team. So we actually have insiders and outsiders at the same time for every project, and I'm excited to sort of go a little bit into how that works. This is our third feature documentary. We also created a short film called My Neighborhood after Budrus that won the Peabody Award, and differently than the other projects, this is not a story of contemporary nonviolent resistance. So our company and our group always focuses on contemporary examples of Palestinian and Israeli nonviolent resistance against the occupation. And this is actually a historical look into what happened during the first Intifada, which took place in the late 80s. We went into the project thinking that we were going to be challenging the dominant narrative that historically Palestinians have used violence, which has kind of perpetuated a law and order framework that have made it possible for the continuation of the occupation. And actually what we found during the research phase, which took 18 months, was that the most strategic and disciplined periods of that uprising took place when the underground resistance was being led by women. And these women had remained invisible up until we started interviewing them, and they had chosen to be anonymous for many reasons, including safety. And this has been a process over 3 years of gaining their trust, of them telling us their stories, and also gathering the footage and creating animation, which you'll get to see a little bit, which is the first time we're using animation, to bring that story to life. So we'll show a clip of it.
All right, so at the control table, let's look at a little clip.
دور أمي بالانتفاضة الأولى كان بالنسبة لي زي بازل.
كنا نروح على المخيمات الفلسطينية بحجة توزيع الخبز. بكل ربطة خبز كنا نزق هالبيان فيه.
أحياناً البيانات كان ينزل فيها تفاصيل مثل إنه الساعة كذا من يوم كذا تطفأ كل الأنوار في البيوت. تطلع من الشباك تلاقي الأنوار مطفية.
When the rock throwing and demonstrations began in the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank, few would have predicted that this latest uprising would prove so difficult for the Israeli army to control. A leadership has emerged, printing and distributing leaflets calling strike days. To the outside world, it is a shadow leadership, insisting on anonymity, but inside the territories, they are developing a grassroots government.
They're depriving us of our rights, they're deporting us, but we're still going to go on and on to prove to the world that we are a people.
كان في قناعة عند الناس إنه هذه الانتفاضة رح توصلنا لحل.
تأكيد على إنه أرض فلسطين هي أرض دولتين لشعبين.
بفتخر إنه أنا حوالي سنة ونص قودت الانتفاضة تقريباً لحالي. كانوا يجوا على رام الله من الشمال، بدنا كذا كذا كذا، وشو رأيكم في كذا؟ يعني مثلاً نحكي لهم غيبوا لكم ساعتين عشان نسأل الأخوة في التنظيم. فشي الأخوة.
The Israelis are targeting every Palestinian effort to create parallel institutions in the occupied territories.
We want to live free.
Anything which could prove to be so much as a seedling for an independent Palestinian state.
يجوا يعتقلوني. قال حط الولد. قلت لهم كيف أحطه؟ فيش عندي حدا يعني.
لهلا عندي فضول إني أعرف أكثر إيش اللي عم بيصير أو إيش اللي صار.
So Julia, can you talk about the group that is behind this film? Now, you yourself have a Brazilian background, and yet you've been working, it seems, for many, many years in this area, and you've spent, you and your colleagues have spent a lot of time forging these relationships. Can you talk about your role as someone who wound up in this place and has devoted a lot of time to it?
Absolutely. I never expected, growing up in Rio, in Brazil, that I would have spent 12 years at this point documenting the stories of Israelis and Palestinians who are struggling to end the occupation on the ground. And I think that the reason why I have remained doing this work is very much because of the team that I get to work with every day. And we have a producer called Rula Salame, who is Palestinian, who has been our partner on the ground, leading the way, not only on the making of the films and thinking through what's the next story that we need to tell, but also thinking through the outreach and impact campaigns that we do after the film. So for Just Vision, it's very important to think through how the film leaves in the world, like where does it go, what it's going to do, how are people going to see it, where it fits into the conversations happening today about not only the critical issues happening in the Middle East itself, but also broadly. So, for example, this film right now is also a film obviously about the Intifada, specifically a moment in Palestinian history, but it's also about people that often remain invisible in movement building, women. This happens across the world, where social movements often include women and end up not getting their due, and we wanted very much to start bringing these stories out so that young women today can feel inspired and take up their rightful space in public life.
And when you talk about the outreach part of it, it reminds me of another dimension to this conversation, is that is who are we making these films for? Often, from our vantage point, when we are having this conversation in New York City, we're often thinking about an audience in the U.S., but certainly as important and sometimes more important are audiences in the communities where these films are taking place.
Yeah, one of the dynamics that we face is that we do make films for multiple audiences. The American audience is critical in our mind, as is the Palestinian audience, and as our international audiences, and Israelis. So we're definitely always thinking about how we can ensure that the film can work in multiple places. And I don't think we would have been able to do that as effectively if we didn't have a diverse team. And I think that is very important in the makeup of our production team. And we always seek out very much to be thinking through this question as we go along.
So Geeta, let's move to you. Last year you were here with a film called Journey of 1,000 Miles, Peacekeepers, which the film is about UN peacekeepers, women from Bangladesh who travel to Haiti on a UN peacekeeping mission. You made this film with Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy, your filmmaking partner. Her background is from Pakistan. Your background is from India. So you're combining those South Asian territories, making a film about Bangladeshis in Haiti. There's many layers to the insider-outsider question here. Why don't you just set up? Do you have a trailer or a clip from the film that we're going to show? Just set that up, and we'll watch it, and then I'll ask you a little bit more.
Sure. So as I just want to say, as Thom put it so succinctly, it was many layers to the insider-outsider story. Charmaine and I, we were colleagues. We worked together years ago, and we re-met. And this was a story that we found. I did not know about women, particularly. There are women who serve as UN peacekeepers from India and Bangladesh, and they're sent out on mission for a year in all-female units. And to me, this story was fascinating because it was really women, the way that women from our part of the world are portrayed in the media, and sort of what you see of them mostly is either often the role of victim or invisible. And when we realized that women from Bangladesh were going, and Bangladesh is a majority Muslim country, that was even more fascinating. Charmaine being from Pakistan, we really wanted to sort of fight back against the stereotypes that you see in the media of Muslim women. And so this film, these women, as Thom mentioned, were sent to Haiti. And so they themselves were outsiders in a very volatile situation in Haiti. And they had a complete, obviously, fish out of water experience. And we were right there with them. Now, we are, obviously, Charmaine and I are from the South Asian diaspora, so there was, even though, being Pakistani and Indian, but it is still a very different culture, the Bangladeshi culture. So for us, there was definitely also a long process of preparation for that, and making sure that we portrayed them accurately.
So Deborah, why don't we look at the trailer from Journey of 1,000 Miles?
আমরা যে মিশনে যাব এক বছরের জন্য, এটা অনেক অনেক বড় একটা পাওয়া আমাদের বাংলাদেশের জন্য।
ওই দেশটায় আনস্টেবল, অর্থাৎ একটা অস্থিতিশীল অবস্থা চলতেছে। আমাদের কাজ হচ্ছে ওদেরকে গিয়ে ওদের এই অবস্থা থেকে উতরানো।
মেয়ে মানুষ পুলিশে আসাটা অনেক কষ্ট। পরে যখন আমার নাম এসছে, তো আমার হাজবেন্ড একদমই রাজি না। এটা নিয়ে অনেক রাগারাগি, 1.5 মাস ধরে আমার সাথে কথাই বলেনি।
আর আমাদের যে ধর্মীয় বিধান মতে দেখা যাচ্ছে একটা নিয়ম বাঁধা আছে।
আমি আমার শালীনতা বোধ রেখে, মনুষ্যত্ব বোধ রেখে যদি আমি চাকরি করি, কোনো চাকরি খারাপ না।
Anti-government protests in Haiti have become increasingly common in recent months amid growing political anger in the Caribbean nation.
ভীষণ মনে হচ্ছিল কোথায় এসে পড়লাম।
Vigilance in this area.
আসলে ডিউটি করতে গেলে কোনো বিপদে পড়বো কিনা এরকম কিছু আমরা আগে থেকে জেনে আসি।
When I came in, I could tell you within 10 minutes that they were not ready to be deployed anywhere. Some of these women have never taken part in a public order demonstration.
একটা বিমান আকাশ দিয়ে গেলে মনে হয় কবে উঠবো আমরাও উঠবো।
ছোট ছেলে বাচ্চাটাকে মিস করেছি। ছেলে বাচ্চাটা বলে পিছনের গেট দিয়ে পালিয়ে আসো আম্মু।
আমি তো একটা পুলিশ, আমি মা না শুধু, আমার সবই আমার ভিতরে থাকতে হবে। মার মায়া মমতাও থাকতে হবে, এবং আমি পুলিশ সৈনিক যে আমার শিথিলতাও থাকতে হবে।
8, 9 ওকে 10 রাউন্ড। মনে হচ্ছে যে চ্যালেঞ্জের জন্য আমরা রেডি। আমরা বাঙালি নারী হিসেবে যে বাংলাদেশের দৃষ্টিভঙ্গি পরিবর্তন করতে পেরেছি, যে আমরা নারীরাও, আমরা পরবর্তীতে আরও চিন্তা ভাবনা করছি যে আমাদের দেশের মেয়েরা যেন আরও অগ্রসর হতে পারে।
So Geeta, I wonder if you could give an example in the course of this filming of a time either in Bangladesh or in Haiti where you faced a kind of a cultural divide in your understanding of how to tell a part of the story, and how you overcame that, how you developed a strategy to deal with it.
I think from the very beginning, obviously there were issues of access with the women. Bangladesh, the culture is incredibly hospitable and welcoming, and although we were treated like family, there also were issues of the women felt that they had to, obviously they were representing their country, and there was fear of doing anything that might shame their country, and they also feared repercussions. That if they were to say anything that was not sort of towing the line of the police department, the Bangladeshi police department, and then further than that, the UN police, that there would be punishment. So it really took us a while to get in, and I think similarly, just to echo what Julia had to say, we had an incredible team. Charmaine and I were very clear that although we come from originally what was one country as Pakistanis and Indians and Bangladeshis, that there are differences and cultural differences, and we made sure to have producers and field producers with us at all times who were Bangladeshi. We hired Bangladeshi women to work with us, and they were an enormous part of bridging that gap. I think that the challenges came into play in Haiti, when the women were very much out of their element, and the UN is seen as an occupation in Haiti, rightly so in many ways. This was in the middle of a cholera epidemic that was introduced by the UN. The women landed in the middle of that and were not briefed in any way or really prepared for what they had to deal with. And there was a point there where, and we also struggled as filmmakers with the story we were trying to tell, even though we had obviously signed on to follow these women. The story of the Haitian people and the Haitian community was incredibly important and compelling. And there was a certain point where we were following both, where we essentially also were following Haitian activists along with the women. And at a certain point, we realized that the Haitian story was not actually our story to tell. And that there were, of course, many Haitian filmmakers and people working on the ground as well, and sort of that really our job was to stick with these women and our original, what we were doing originally. And what was really challenging for us as well is the women, because they themselves were struggling to adjust and understand their own situation in Haiti, and to connect with the population there, that we almost had to stand back and be observational and allow that to happen. There were often times where we almost wanted to step in, which is an interesting issue, that as filmmakers, we felt a lot of frustration at what was sometimes their own ability to be able to manage their situation that they were in. But of course, it is not our job to interfere. So I think that was one of the sort of insider-outsider issues. And sometimes they would ask us, because ironically we spoke, within our crew, we spoke both French and Spanish, and so the women only spoke Bengali. So there were issues where they would sometimes ask us to step in and interpret, and it would put us in positions that we weren't necessarily meant to be in. So
tricky. Amber Ferris, let's talk about your project. Speed Sisters played here at the festival last year, am I right? Why don't I ask you to describe what Speed Sisters is and who the filmmaking team was behind it?
Sure. Speed Sisters is about the first all-women race car driving team in the Middle East. They're based in Palestine in the West Bank. And I came across them. I myself am Canadian Lebanese. My grandparents came from Lebanon, and at a sort of twist of fate and just out of interest, I ended up in Palestine, which was supposed to be for 6 months, doing work that had nothing to do with film. And I was just so got really engaged and really loved the community and being there. And I ended up staying for 7 years by accident. But during that time, I had been living in Palestine for about 3 years and had come across these race car drivers and really just felt like it was a story that I wanted to tell. It was, I think, for me growing up as an Arab in Canada, there had always been obvious stereotypes, especially after 9/11, a lot of pushback towards Arab communities, both Muslim and Christian. And I think for me, I was looking for that story that was able to, the experience that I had in my family in traveling to Lebanon and being with, my Arab family in Canada was always a very warm and lighthearted, a lot of, it was just an experience that I was never reflected on TV, on any sort of media, and I wanted to bring that to audiences. So when I met these girls, that was sort of, I saw it as opportunity. So the film was made by myself and my producer partner, Avi Goldstein, who is American-Israeli, and we had met in Palestine playing street hockey, as everyone does in Ramallah, playing on a street hockey league that I had organized, and we had made a couple of projects together, and sort of stumbled across this one, and so I was mostly in the field, and Avi was very much producing it, and but it was usually myself, and then we had 2 APs at different times that were both sort of American and Palestinian, so they spoke both languages quite well. And I actually found that for this story, what was really nice is that when we were filming is that we had the whole crew. The crew that was with them for the really intimate points was always myself, one of the assistant producers, and then sometimes we had a camera person, Lucy. So it was always women. The crew was all women, and so it was created a very intimate sort of environment for the girls. But I also think that us having a great understanding of the Arab culture, but being 1 foot removed, like sort of being 1 foot in, 1 foot out, actually helped, because it took off a lot of pressure for them. There's a lot of society, pressure by society, feeling free that they can say what they wanted to say, that there wasn't any sort of judgment, things were not going to get out to people. And so I think that having that distance, but having, that familiarity actually really helped with us. And then we brought on a producer, Jessica Devaney, who actually works for Just Vision as well. So she had a lot of intimate knowledge of Palestine. And then I think the real key person for us was Rabab Haj Yahya, who was a Palestinian editor. And I think what we really needed was somebody that did have that understanding of the place and had and understood the language in the way that none of us really did, that really helped us bring out sort of the nuances in the film. So the film itself, like in my head, it was always for a North American audience that we wanted to show it to, because I wanted it to show it to, to combat like sort of where I grew up. But what we really realized is that this film is so powerful for Arab, not only Palestinians who are, very, very proud to see it and really love the film, but for Arab communities that are countries that are outside, they can't travel to Palestine. Like, you can't live in Lebanon and get a visa to go to Palestine. So it's a place that other Arabs just don't know anything about. And the film's been really great that way in terms of sort of breaking those stereotypes and sort of bringing in people into this world that they're very interested in.
Well, I think we have a trailer of Speed Sisters. Let's take a look at that.
من باب ربما السخرية الهادفة أنه يمكن في كل دول العالم يزبط راليات إلا بفلسطين، أنه بدك تصطدمي بحاجز عسكري إسرائيلي كل شوي.
بنات تشاركوا على مستوى العالم العربي، احنا أول بنات إلنا فريق.
هدفي اني اخلي كل العالم تعرف انه في وحده اسمها مرح زحالكه بتمثل فلسطين.
أنا بعرفش يعني من الحياة اللي عشتها والحرمان اللي عشته أنا انعكست باتجاه آخر بالنسبة لأولادي.
احنا بدنا تتعلم يا دكتورة يا تتعلمي، بدنا إشي ما بين العلوم اللي قيمتها.
تركيز 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 تركيز.
وانا نوصل يعني نوقف حياتنا خلاص نضل قاعدين لا.
I wonder if in the course of making this film, you ever faced a situation where, especially because some of the subject matter is, pushing against more conservative traditions of, what women should be doing. I wonder if you ever faced a situation of, people saying, well, what are you doing here? Stirring this up. You're not from here. Did anything like that ever come up, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, actually, no, it didn't. I found that, filming within the Palestinian community was, for the most part, a real joy. I mean, they're very, very open. They're very accommodating. And we, had cameras everywhere, like following those girls everywhere. And there was, very, very few times that we were ever told not to film, and definitely not to film what we were filming. The only time I think we ran into trouble a couple of times with police, because they're drifting and they're not allowed to do that. And so there was a couple of times that we got pulled over, and all that really happened is you make a phone call to somebody who knows somebody. It's called wasta. If there's any Arabs in the audience, they will know what I'm talking about. And it's just a matter of who has more wasta, right? So I would know the lawyer to the prime minister, and I would call him, and boom, within 20 minutes, set, we're gone, right? So that was sort of, I think it's that kind of stuff that you need to know. Like, it's less about people saying to you, no, you can't film this, we don't want to show you this. It's more about if something happens, to know the system, because the system isn't like you call the police and they come and help. And it's a different, and it took a couple years for me to sort of build up enough wasta that I could get out of I'm pretty confident I could get out of any situation in Palestine, yeah.
That probably is the core of all insider-outsider storytelling.
Exactly, that's how you know you've made it.
All right, let me finally turn to Alaa Hassan. Alaa is part of the producing team behind a film called The War Show that had its world premiere at the Venice Film Festival this year, where it won an award. I showed it at the Toronto International Film Festival. It is made by a team that primarily the film is set in Syria, tracing the course of the war, and the people labeled as co-directors on this film are Obaid Zaitoun, one of the women who is part of the group of friends that you see in the film, and she worked with the other Syrians behind this on the project for a long time, and then brought in the Danish director Andreas Dalsgaard, who's has a lot of experience making documentaries, to help shape the material. And so Andreas is someone who'd never been to Syria, but was editing this material in Denmark. Alaa, you're from Syria. You've been in New York now for 3 years. Can you describe what your part was in the project of The War Show?
First, thanks for having me. These are all, awesome, really. Well, I was brought into The War Show because there was...
Get the mic close.
Is this better? Right. So I was brought into The War Show because there was a real need to put together this project in a way that was satisfying to the Syrians that are working on it, and at the same time accessible to the global audience, because Syria is one of the most covered conflicts yet, and it seems that everywhere I go, people do have opinions about it, and in that way, it seemed that it was this separation between everybody and everybody. Everyone had an opinion about Syria, and so we had to consider the fact that a global audience is watching carefully, and that Syrians are highly sensitive about what we say in the film, because the situation did not finish. It's still going on. The war in Syria is still happening. The revolution is still happening, whatever you call it, actually, which is part of why it took a long time to finish the film. Well, I was brought in to help write the final kind of skeleton, that would work from both perspectives. And the way that we did it is we got the Syrians to start writing their own story. And then we got the Danish team to kind of, especially Andreas, who's pretty well experienced in just forming a film, regardless of how much he knows about the situation, to just make it accessible, make everybody able to understand it. And so, yeah, that was basically my job, is to bridge this side and that side, because there's a huge gap between how Syrians perceive themselves and each other, and how anybody outside Syria would perceive Syria. And so, yeah.
Well, I think we have a trailer from the war show.
داي شو شعورك يا بنت؟ لا ما لقطت فوتو، رجع
هدول الناس صاروا عائلتي المختارة.
حتضل تتظاهر؟
طبعا.
طب لإمتى؟
تسقط النظام.
وخايف؟
أبدا.
الكل عم يشهد لحظات التحول الأولى.
اللي بيسكت على الظلم وشبع الأخرار. رئيس شعب غزة، شكرا جزيلا لكم، شكرا لكم، شكرا.
أول خوف للنظام كان من يلي حملوا الكاميرا.
بس بال 2014 بتعرفي بيكون تحررنا بال 2014.
هيك سكتي بال 2014 ونكون ميتين عم ضحك عليك.
شفت العلامات الأشد على الخراب. لا شفاء، لا عزاء.
الشعب يريد خلافة إسلامية. الشعب قد يسرقكم. مدني مسار صف الأنصار يا جماعة. نحن للإسلام حصن. لا تصوري لا تصوري لا تصوري.
When summer's gone, where will we be?
So, Alaa, can you give an example of, of something that came up in the creative process where between Andreas and as a Danish filmmaker and the Syrians making this film, were coming at things from different points of view and how you solved that?
Let me narrow it down. Actually, a lot of the time, Andreas was a great listener, which is actually the best thing that he did was he listened to everybody's stories very carefully. And every time he would come back to the Syrians, whoever they are, whether they're characters or people in the... Because just to explain this, we have a lot of the footage was filmed by people who are characters, actually almost everything. And so it was also complicated. So it was also complicated to actually get their stories perfect from one perspective of one director. So what Andreas did perfectly was listening. He came back to Obeida, who's the Syrian director, with, okay, what about this version of this scene? And she was like, no, you don't know this fact, that fact. And so you'd go back, work on it harder, and say, what about this version of that scene? A couple of times it was a big difference was when we tried to describe the war as the war really took on in Syria halfway in 2012. It was perceived by a lot of Syrians as this war by the people against the Syrian government, or by Islamists against the government by other people. And for someone who's, for Andreas, saw it from an outsider's perspective, and in an outsider perspective, you only see that there are two sides fighting each other. You don't really care who's right and who's wrong as much as the people that are deeply involved in it, and that's where a lot of the conflict comes from. I mean, the discussion within the team. Then I think one of the most essential parts was one of our characters. She takes her hijab off. She used to wear hijab, and then when the protest movement starts, she decided to take her hijab off. And the idea was that, do we make a big deal out of it in terms of, do we rely on this as something that represents a lot of women or not? And I think it was more attractive for an outsider's perspective to say, right? Here's a woman who is, being forced to wear hijab. Now she decided to, as this, very romantic viewing of it, while it didn't really matter much for her, actually. It was something that she did sometimes and sometimes not, and she decided that, okay, that's it for me. She didn't want to identify as the girl who took her hijab off. And so, in a way, we also needed that because she did it. So we wanted to have this in the film, but we couldn't really identify her with it. So we came with a solution where it is included, but it doesn't construct her character. It's just one feature of it. So that's, I think that's a good example of it.
All of you have deep experience in parts of the world where lots of times we do see, outsiders come in to tell a story a lot more quickly than the time investment that each of you have put in, and sometimes there's unquestionable value that someone comes in, tells a story. Not everyone can spend 3 years in a region to get immersed in it. I wonder, maybe, I hope this isn't too broad a question, what your advice is to people who are coming somewhere where they are, where they're an outsider and, need to tell a story. What do you do to avoid pitfalls?
I do want to get to the question, but I just wanted to share I think there is a sort of macro level of this question in terms of the insider-outsider that I just wanted to put out there, because I think that broadly speaking, we do have a problem of representation in the film industry, and we do need more diversity, and we do need more people telling their own stories, and I absolutely agree with that 100%. And I think that there's also, as you said earlier, incredible films being made by people who are not from this place. I'm Brazilian, and my favorite film that has been made about Brazilian society is called Pichote, which was made by an Argentinian filmmaker. I think one of my favorite films of all times is The Battle of Algiers, which was made by an Italian filmmaker. It's about the Algerian Revolution. And I think then when you look at how these films were made, who was part of the team, how did that take place? You see that Battle of Algiers was co-written by the head of the Algerian Revolution, and he was part of the scriptwriter, and he actually acted on the film. And so I think we often simplify these questions of insider-outsider, and I think bringing complexity and nuance to the conversation is important, but I also don't want to distract us from I think the need, and I think we're moving towards that, of more representation and more diversity in the film industry as a whole. And I think I partly answered your question, which I think is, who do you bring in your team? Like who is making the film with you personally is, for me, one of the key aspects of ensuring that I am not carrying all of my biases and all of my lack of local knowledge and sort of having been brainwashed, from years of growing up and etc. into me telling of the story. And also, I think you brought a critical point. I mean, that was such a great example. Like, the woman takes the hijab. What is the meaning of the woman taking the hijab, right? It means something so different. And I think for that, unless you have lived for a long time and you have a lot of experience, it is critical to have someone to be able to give you the feedback and to tell you, no, you're overplaying this. I know that would be very nice for Western audiences, and would get you great reviews and people would be applauding you, women's liberation has happened, but it actually didn't mean that. And I think it's very important to not assign meaning to events in your characters' lives that they do not believe merit that. And I think that's one of the key parts of making sure you have people to bounce off that are very knowledgeable.
Just to add to that, I think that I would say too that I agree with everything that Julia just said, but I think also one of the things that really resonated for me is that ultimately, even though originally I am from India and I very much identify as a person of color here in the U.S., I also have a certain coming from the U.S. Ultimately, I'm based here. There's often we have a certain we walk with a certain privilege, right? Like you take that into the situations that you go into. And I think we also, as Julia said, come embodied with certain stereotypes of culture. We have our own implicit biases that exist within us, and I would say even as an Indian woman, my perception of Bangladesh is shaped by, what I have, obviously I have friends and family who are from Bangladesh, but it doesn't matter. There's something you almost have to do, as Julia said, a detox of everything you think you know. And I do agree with the relying heavily on your team. But that, I think the issue of the Western lens, which has traditionally been a white Western lens, it is, even though we may not, obviously we have a different, we believe we come from a different place, we are also influenced by it because we are aware of it. We are aware of this moment, as you said, the hijab moment, it's so perfect. This, for a Western audience, would resonate greatly. For me in my film, I struggled with issues of, these women were often some of them were defying their husbands to leave and go out, which is obviously, and then, and Muslim culture is often portrayed as incredibly repressive. There was one husband who was repressive in our film, but the others were very egalitarian. And we did make sure to take moments to defy stereotypes on all sides in our film, and I think that is also really important, to not cater to the stereotypes that exist in Western media. So before you go into a situation, you have to know what they are and do your best to not perpetrate them.
I do want to make time for some questions from the audience, so let me do that right now. If anyone has a question, raise your hand. I'll call on you, and you can be a part of this conversation. Yep, right there. This is a question about the role of using narration in a film, but I think often in the world of independent documentary, we feel critical of the omniscient narrator who's delivering information kind of abstractly. It feels impersonal. Does anyone have thoughts about the use of narration? Yeah.
Well, for our film, The War Show, the narrator that came from outside the issue was very, very useful. He helped put everything in place for us, because sometimes you get indulged in a situation and you can't explain it when you are so stuck on details. And someone who's more an outsider could actually let you see that, hey, I'm an outsider and I don't understand what you're talking about sometimes, or all the nuances of the situation. So in my experience, it was very, very useful to have someone from outside. But I think it also has to
when we're talking about a narrator, I think she might be referring to like a voice in the film. Oh. In the War Show, I should say, there is a narrative voice in the film. It's the voice of Obeida, who is telling a first-person story about this group of friends.
Interestingly, though, even though she's telling the narration, like the voiceover, they both wrote it together. And the writing of the voiceover was a long, difficult process because of that, because of what I just said, and he helped to kind of contextualize everything in a place where everybody can relate to it.
Just a side note here, we could have the same conversation about documentary curating as much as we could about documentary programming. In fact, when I got a rough cut of The War Show, I watched it. I thought it was very intriguing. There was stuff that I didn't feel myself well equipped enough in that region to understand certain nuances. So I shared it with my colleague Rasha Salti, who lives in Lebanon, and has, who speaks Arabic and knows this much more closely. And she wrote back to me and said, I think it's very good. At this point, it had rough narration. She said, but I don't understand why some of the narration is in classical Arabic and some is in colloquial Arabic, which is just the way it had been roughed in. Of course, me as an outsider, that had totally gone past me. Any other thoughts on narration, or we could take another question?
Yeah, I think for me, it wasn't an option. That we were telling the story of these girls from their perspective, and for us, we sort of made, a creative decision that what goes in the film is things that they experienced firsthand, and so it was very important for them to sort of narrate. So there wasn't a narrator at all. The story sort of flew, was pieced together through their own sort of interviews and stuff like that. So, but it was definitely a decision not to that the voice needed to be theirs, and it needed to be in sort of present time.
Okay, let's take another question right here. So the question is, of all the roles in production, directing, producing, editing, etc., are there roles where an outsider can be more helpful in one than any other? Probably producing. Whoever has the most money is good as a producer.
I think that it's more about the overall composition of the team. I wouldn't say that there is a particular role that, it's better to be outsider or insider. I think you want to have people that have the diversity of opinions as part of your in-group, so that they can call you up on it and be like, this is not right. So make sure that however you make it, that I think Alaa mentioned that you have a very open mind, that you listen as the outsider, and really respect that there are things that you don't know. And I think that's the key, whether it's the editor, the producer. There's an advantage to having the editor, and I think, Amber shared some of that. And
yeah, I was going to say, I wouldn't, because my Arabic is terrible. 7 years was not enough for me to learn Arabic, unfortunately. Arabic is not strong enough to be able to carry that film, so we needed to have somebody in that particular case that understood the language in a way, and it had very strong comprehension of the language, and so that worked for us. But if I had been, a fluent Arabic speaker, I may not have needed to rely on a Arabic-speaking editor as much.
Right here. So the question is, for a first-time filmmaker, how do you begin to build your team?
I think you can basically, I think it's almost a responsibility. This is interesting, and this sort of speaks a little to your question. But if you are an outsider, it is your job to find the insiders. It is your job. They exist, for sure. There's in every country and every culture around the world, there is someone from that area that is a filmmaker or that works in the media, and it's really about reaching out there's networks that exist within that countries. I mean, even in news, for example, there's fixers all over the world. So even sometimes, I know in documentary film, you start there, or you go to organizations, community organizations, that here in the U.S. and particularly in New York, you can find a community organization for everyone. It's really about doing a deep dive. But I do think that if you are going to be an outsider on a film, if you're going to be an outsider and take on that film, you have an obligation to make sure that you find a team that works with you.
I think if I was making my first film right now, what I would do is watch the films that I think are about hitting the kind of stories that I want to tell. If I love them, look at the credits, take down their names, find a contact information, be like, I would love to talk to this producer, would love to talk to this editor, who's your associate producer? And they might maybe not be ready to take your project because you're a first timer, but they will know people. So they will probably tell you, I'm busy, but I know such and such. And they will know people who are up and coming and who will be more open probably to then take on your project if they fall in love with it.
And in documentary too, news again is a huge, there's, for example, I know that there's Al Jazeera, there's places, there's news organizations that are all over the world that have contacts. That's even an easy, films obviously exist, and then there's news as well, where you can find great crew.
I'm actually working on a film right now that's, I was just out in Standing Rock last week, And I was there with an American filmmaker, white American filmmaker. I grew up in Canada and have like a little bit of an understanding about Aboriginal issues, but definitely not. And we went out there before even really filming anything, went out to look for contacts, right? In those contacts could be the characters as well, but it was basically talking to people. Our characters will help us shape those stories as well, just in terms of what they can tell us and who they'll connect us to and stuff like that. Because there's just no way. Like we spent 5 days there, hardly shot anything, but at least walked away with a whole bunch of connections, some potential characters, and that we can go back and make the film. But we had to do that due diligence to because that's not a story that I would feel comfortable telling without sort of creating a group of people around me that had more of an intimate understanding.
We need to wrap this portion up. I do want to let you know tomorrow we've got a full day dedicated to documentary and journalism at Doc NYC Pro. It's going to kick off at 10 a.m. with a conversation between Laura Poitras and her collaborator, Henrik Moltke. So I hope you can be there for that. Right now, we're going to move upstairs to the Doc NYC Pro Lounge for a reception co-presented by Image Nation Abu Dhabi. We thank them for their support of this panel and the reception. And in fact, I should say, as an example of homegrown filmmaking, there's a film later this week called The Lights of Rome, a story set in the UAE by a UAE filmmaking team about their soccer team, and for a relatively young country like the United Arab Emirates. It's a film that tells a homegrown story about their football team, and is probably a rare opportunity in documentary making to see that kind of national perspective. So thank you very much for coming. Thanks especially to our panelists, Julia Bacha, Geeta Gandbhir, Amber Ferris, and Alaa Hassan.